Morning, everybody. It is time to get started. So we've got a lively crowd this morning. That's a good sign. So as we prepare to get started this morning, we will be covering Hosea this morning. Just an overview of Hosea. As we get into our study of Amos and Hosea, we did Amos last week. We'll look at Hosea this week. And as John and I were talking, there's so much, even from an overview perspective, that we feel like we want to get into. A lot of details, a lot of things we could look at, but we want to be careful not to go too far down those roads and cover things that we're going to be covering in future classes. So we do have some things to talk about, maybe some perspectives to look at this morning. So we'll get started. I know Joe has a mic, Jared has a mic, and Eric has a mic. Eric doesn't know he has a mic. Surprise, Eric. But as we're getting started, I believe Joe's going to open us up with a word of prayer this morning.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we're just so thankful for this day that you've given us, thankful for the many blessings that you shower in our lives. We're thankful now for this opportunity to dive into your word, Father. Give us understanding and give us wisdom. Give us the courage to live out the truths that you put in front of us, Father, and give us the intellectual honesty to see them when they come across the page, Father. Give us all strength as we try to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow you. Be with us the rest of this day. Be with those of our number who are battling sickness and injury and surgeries, and that they might be soon back to their full health. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay. Now let me remind everybody, this is a discussion class. You don't want to hear me and Jonathan talk for 45 minutes. We don't
want to hear each other talk for 45 minutes.
That is true. So we want you to answer some questions, give us your ideas and opinions. We've got lots of stuff we want to discuss, so please don't be shy. If you want to use the mic, that's great. If you don't want to use the mic, that's fine too. Whatever you want to do, we just want you to discuss, answer questions.
Be involved.
Involved, ask questions, all the above.
So as we open up this morning and we look at just sort of an introduction to Hosea, what do most people remember about Hosea? And I'll share with you, one of our nieces was staying with us last night, and I told her I was working on some material for Hosea, and she goes, "Oh, I love Hosea. That's my favorite minor prophet." And I think a lot of us kind of relate to that message or remember the story of that message, but what do we remember about it mostly?
That's not what I remember. Why?
That'd be your favorite?
No. I like Hosea.
Yeah.
It's not a good remembrance.
Not a good remembrance.
Right.
So what do most people think of or remember about Hosea? Had to marry a prostitute. Why do we remember that? Yeah.
Yeah, my voice doesn't carry me. Gomer left Hosea, and she lived with this man for many years, and she became old. And she had 2 illegitimate children by him. And he eventually, God told him, he says, if you don't take Israel back, I won't take Gomer back, I won't take Israel back. So consequently, he took Gomer back, and he took her 2 children and raised them as his own.
Yeah,
and he bought her off a slave.
So that process and that kind of storyline we see in Hosea's life, thank you for that. It's kind of graphic, for being honest. It's very, very personal. I mean, a lot of the prophets we've seen have been tasked to do difficult things and go through difficult circumstances. But I think this story, and this really, Hosea living a parable, in a sense, really resonates with us on a personal level. It's something that we can identify with, the frustration, the love or lack thereof, the joy. There's a lot there, but we tend to remember the bad. I think there are a few things that maybe we remember that we don't realize. Some passages that maybe we're more familiar with than come to mind. And John, I think you had a few examples of that.
Yeah, do you want to get into some of those right now?
Yeah, we can look at that.
All right. So the whole point is, I think you guys know a lot more about Hosea than you think you do. At least on 3 passages, because there's 3 very well-known passages that are quoted in the New Testament that come straight from Hosea. So let's just talk about the first one, okay? When Joseph was warned about the attempt to kill the children when Jesus was born, where did Joseph take his family to avoid Jesus being killed when he was young? Egypt. He took him to Egypt, okay? When the threat was over, he was brought out of Egypt. And what does Matthew say about that? Right, for out of Egypt I have called my son, which is a direct quote from Hosea 11:1. Hosea 11:1 says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew says, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. So see, that's something about Hosea you probably didn't know that you knew. All right? So now let's talk about a second passage that's in the New Testament. And this one should be familiar to you because it hasn't been that long since we've taken a good look at Romans and what Paul had to say to the Romans. So we were just talking about Gomer. And right after that, where he talks about the children that are called no mercy and not my people, this is a little unusual in Hosea because the message kind of shifts for one verse and says it's all going to be okay, because it says, and in that place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. Now that's in chapter 1, verse 10 of Hosea. So the Lord has just told Hosea, name this child no mercy, because I'm going to have no mercy on the children of Israel. Name this child not my people, because these are not my people anymore. And then God immediately switches the message and says, in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. Now, do you know where that is in Romans and what Paul has to say about that? Yeah, Romans 9. Romans 9, verses 25 and 26. Paul is saying, as indeed he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people. And her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. So Paul goes through an exposition of that passage and explains what that means. So see, you know the Romans passage, you know the prophecy about Jesus in Matthew. So that's a lot more about Hosea than you probably thought. So one more passage, if I can find it here. Does this sound familiar to you? Hosea 13:14 says, O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Yeah, Paul quotes that in 1 Corinthians 15:55, and he says, O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? So that's another passage from Hosea. So 3 very well-known passages in the New Testament come straight from Hosea.
So as we think about this narrative through Hosea, especially the first few chapters, which Hosea is really largely famous for, being told to marry a woman who will be unfaithful to him. When you look at that, to kind of put our modern lens on it, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in that story? Who does right? Hosea, maybe? Or is it Gomer? Does Gomer do right? Does she live a morally and godly life? No. But Hosea does. So there's this conflict, this sense of conflict right there, which God uses to illustrate the relationship he has, but current state of the relationship between Israel, his chosen people, his bride, as it were, and himself. So when we read that story, who are you rooting for? Whose side are you on? Are you pulling for Hosea? Are you pulling for Gomer? Who do you relate to more? Praying for forgiveness. I think we all probably act like Gomer in a lot of senses, in a lot of ways. But really, what tugs at our heart is we feel bad for Hosea, don't we? We don't like the way he's treated. We don't like what he is told to do by God. And when we think about that and we start peeling back those layers, and we apply that same relationship to us. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more today and as we go on. Does that change how we behave? Does that change our attitude towards sin or attitude toward God or how we act?
It sure should.
It should.
Yeah.
It should.
The whole point that Hosea is trying to show us, the book, is that our sin makes God feel the way that he shows Hosea how Gomer makes him feel.
Exactly.
You know, even though we may not have completely turned away from God the way that Israel is depicted in the book, you know, where they have completely given themselves to foreign gods. We don't completely give ourselves to foreign gods, but we have to recognize when it is that we are in peril of doing that. You know, when we take and focus on our work to the point where motivation for money becomes a god to us, then we are acting like Gomer. And we have to recognize that. We have to realize that we put ourselves in peril of tendering God's anger, you know, and we don't ever want to be in the point where we inflame God to want to punish us like he punishes Israel, because ultimately here Israel is going to be completely and utterly destroyed.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you think, you think about it, it's so serious that God tells Hosea to name two children, no mercy and not my people. Now, think about that. God is saying that he will have no mercy on his people and that they are no longer his people, not my people. I mean, those are two things that you just do not want to hear.
It's very clear and very, very to the point.
But
Yeah.
as we're going to see later in Hosea, there's several passages where it says, and yet they did not return to me. Very similar to what we discussed last week in Amos.
I think his actions help drive his message home so so much more even with the people at that time, because I imagine everybody knew his story. I mean, at least friends and family and acquaintances, and they were like, "Why are you doing this? Like, what are your thoughts?" And he's like, and then he makes that parallel. Well, you did this with God, and God's willing to take you back. And so, I mean, and we recently talked about this with the teenage class. That was a fun conversation. And so we're going through the minor prophets, but it was, if you act different than the world around you, it opens up doors and gives you a platform for you to introduce God to people. If you act differently than the way the world expects you to act.
Yeah. And as we look at that, and I love how all this, at least in my mind, great comments from Jared, comes back to love. God's love for his people and the people's love for God, or lack thereof. And I know we bring this up a lot, but what is the foundation of the law and prophets? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself, right? And we see an absence of that. But I want to talk about that for just a minute as we get into this. For those who are married, why did you choose your spouse? Love, right? What about our friends? Probably there's a connection, but there's a sense of love, of brotherly love in that is there as well. It's why we form a bond, we form a connection with each other. I mean, what about our family? I mean, why do we put so much time and effort into maintaining relationships and building them, and strengthening them? Excuse me. It's love. And that's really at the core what this message is about, God's love for his people. And we will see that as we see the redemption arc, or the offer of redemption that will come later. But with that, I wanted to ask the question this morning, how do you define love? What is that to you? And feel free to take the poll or just shout something out. But how do you define love? And I'm not looking for all the different words that we can use to describe love, the family love, the brotherly love, just in general. What does love mean to you?
Well, everybody's thinking and responding. One thing I thought of is if you read Hosea, you read the Minor Prophets, you read Psalms, you see that the word love is often said as steadfast love. And they put that word steadfast, that's used throughout the Psalms. And one of my favorite verses in Hosea is where God was talking to the people of Israel. It says, your love was like a little morning cloud, and a little morning dew just evaporates in a short time, just gone. There was a cloud, now it just disappears. There's dew on the ground, and it's just gone. And that's one of the accusations that God is making to the people of Israel. It's just the opposite of the idea of steadfast love.
It's not working. I know I noticed, and completely as an aside, on Apple devices, the QR code to scan has not been working quite right recently. We noticed that on some things at work as well, that it's not wanting to pull up for some reason.
Selflessness and sacrifice.
Selflessness and sacrifice. Good answer. Anybody else have anything?
Yep, sacrifice was one of the other words I had on my list here. Sacrifice.
Seeking the best, affection. Yeah. And I came across this idea, and I thought, it's not unique to me or to this author, but that the idea that love goes beyond a dictionary definition. It's not just words that you can put down on paper and really describe it. I mean, how many books, how many poems, how many things have been written about love trying to express it, and it still doesn't capture the full range of emotion of what we feel. It's something that has to be experienced. It's something that has to be felt. And I think when we think about that from the aspect of God and his people, and we see that exemplified in Hosea and Gomer as we go through this narrative, that God is trying to show his people, not just tell his people about love, but trying to show them about his love. Let them experience and see what that's really like as they go through. Very familiar passages. But husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing of water through the word, to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish. Do we see that in Hosea? How do we see that? How does that apply to what we read about in Hosea?
Well, if Hosea acted simply as a man, he would not go and redeem her.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry, but most men, if your wife went and did what Gomer did, you let her go. You give her up. Give her to the streets, as some people might say.
She made her choice.
That's right. But what Hosea does is what Jesus has done for us. He took us when we were enemies, when we were rebellious, when we were against him, and he broke our heart to make us appreciate what he had done for us. And that's what God does.
That's what God does. Is that what we do?
That's how we should act.
How we should. But why is that so hard?
We don't want to act like God.
We don't want to act like God sometimes. It's so hard sometimes for us to deal with others, especially people we don't like or people who have wronged us, to deal with those people in a loving way and in a righteous way. That's tough. We want that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's, for a lot of us, that's how we think. Scott?
Yeah, so much of the time it's not. Much of the time it's not even what the other people have done. It's just that we're not willing to do what we need to do. Okay? Hosea was willing to do what he needed to do, even though his wife, was continuing to do things that were wrong. But for us, as we've heard a million times, and as Joe said in his prayer a while ago, it's picking up your cross daily. It's putting God before yourself. And so we're not willing to do that as often as we should, as humans, really never, but, overall. But that's what we need to be able to do.
Yeah, and we lose the perspective that in this comparison, in this story, we are Gomer. We don't want to admit that, but that's the role we play. Joe?
May not have the time Wednesday night, Lord willing, but there's a really strong tie-in to John 4 when we take a look at who Hosea is talking to. The people that come after that, the direct descendants, will be Samaritans, and so God goes to the Samaritans, or Jesus goes to the Samaritans, and who does he deal with at the well? Well, he deals with a sinful woman at the well, and she's redeemed. And we see her actions that she goes and she spreads the news to. But it's just along the lines of Scripture pointing to Jesus, and that's just kind of even though it's not a passage that goes from point A to point B, it's an example that goes from point A to point B.
It points us in the right direction. So as we'll move on from this, John, unless you had something else.
Nope, go ahead.
So just look at the background of Hosea, and we'll get into that a little bit. And first thing that kind of came up is I was doing some studying, and we're looking at this was the religion of the day. So just in general, what do y'all know about the religious attitude, the religious atmosphere of the people that day? We've talked about this when we talked about Amos, but what do you remember?
I mean, they still worshiped God, but they brought in all sorts of the idols and brought Baal in. And, I mean, it was a hodgepodge of different things mixed in with Jehovah.
Yeah. And this was a perspective that I had not seen and came across this in study, but just basically it was confused, what was the best word, that their religion was confused. That because of the Baals had been set up, because that worship was going on, it seemed that a lot of the people seemed to equate Jehovah God with the Baal God, that they did not really distinguish between the two in their own minds. And Hosea seems to indicate that as he's writing. And then to make things worse, we have the golden calves, which keep popping up, and they have over and over. But Baal was depicted as a bull. So you've got these golden calves, which has that connection. You've got the worship places, the high places that were set up apart from Jerusalem. And the people were told by the leadership, by the kings, by the priests, that this is how you worship, and this is how you worship God, your God. And we see a strong condemnation multiple times through Hosea for the priests, for the kings, for leading the people down this direction. But the people saw Baal worship really as synonymous with worshiping Jehovah. And I mean, that is such a bad place to be. When they would participate in sacrifice and in the feast and the things that they did toward Baal, they saw that as a worship to God, even though it was doing things that were completely contrary to what God had taught.
Now, one of the things, Jonathan, that struck me about this is because I think this era was somewhat prosperous. There was a lot of trade, a lot of commerce.
Started that way, yeah.
That was going on. There were a lot of nations around them, and they traded, lots of commerce, lots of trade, and essentially part of that was all the cultural and all the religious stuff kind of came with it. I mean, you remember discussions before about there were the gods of the hills, the gods of the plains, the gods of the valleys. I mean, every place seemed to have their own set of gods, and they went with them whenever they went, traveled, did anything. And so you've got this, the religion was confused, but you also have this big mixture. I mean, to me, it felt a lot like what we saw Paul encounter at Athens when he says, there's an idol here for every god you can imagine, including one to an unknown God. That kind of feels like what we're looking at here is like every one of the different versions of these gods, there's something there.
There's something for everybody.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads us into whether this will pull up or not. But
If the QR code doesn't work, you can just go to Slido and type in the number. That always
yeah,
works.
or shout out. It's not working?
The number didn't work either.
All right. Well, we'll just ask the question. Okay. Brandon says it's working now. When we look at modern worship across Christianity as a whole, what sins do we tend to ignore? What idols do we put before God? Because there's that potential for us to make the same mistake Israel did, and that we take the worship of self or the worship of something else, and we blend that into our worship to God. That is a danger for us, and I think we see that. But what kind of things do we tend to kind of ignore or overlook that are sins that we just kind of, that's a small thing. I'm not going to worry about that. Untamed tongue, very good answer. Very good answer.
I think one of the things that's got to affect a lot of people, at least it does me a lot, is just, you get busy. You got a lot of stuff going on. I mean, you got your job, you got your family, you got other stuff happening. And it's just like you're just going through the whole day, and all of a sudden you get to the end of the day, and it's like, wait a second, what happened to the day?
Yeah.
How did I even get here? And it's like, well, wait a second, did I even think about God at all
Right.
during this day? I was just trying to get stuff done. I mean, I'm one of these guys that, I start every day with, there's a list of to-dos, and I'm a failure if I can't get at least half of them done that day. And so, I'm just checking off things one right after another, and I get to the end of the day, and it's like, wait a second. How did I even get here at 7 o'clock? What's going on? And have I even thought about God all day?
So we pretend to worship. We put other things ahead. Coveting, greed, I think those two kind of go together. Covetousness, pride is probably a bigger one than we care to admit. Elevating self goes along with that. Selfishness, controlling our tongue. And we could probably sit and make a list for the next hour of things that we put ahead of God. But the point is to be aware of that pitfall, to be aware of that danger, and learn the lessons from mistakes others made so that we don't have to make those same mistakes ourselves. Moving on into Hosea, just from a high level, what do we know about the man Hosea? What do we know about who Hosea was?
I don't think we know very much.
So silence is actually a pretty accurate answer.
Yeah, that's kind of an accurate answer. We don't really know a lot. I will tell you one thing that struck me is that if you look at the first chapter of Hosea and you compare it to, let's say, the first chapter of Jeremiah, for example, when Jeremiah was called and when Hosea was called. So the first thing that Jeremiah was told by God was, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you, and I've appointed you a prophet to the nations. To me, that's kind of a humbling thing, but that's kind of a good thing. If God's going to come to you and say you're going to be a prophet, saying that before he formed you in the womb, he knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. That's pretty good. The first words that Hosea hears from God, go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom right now. That's
I'd want an extra sign.
Pull a Gideon, right?
Lord, but I need a
I
sign.
need
Yeah.
Sure that's right.
yeah.
Is there a plan B?
Yeah, is there a plan
Are
B?
you sure, God?
Yeah.
Right.
Or just pull a Jonah. Okay?
Right.
Give
Right.
me a ship.
I don't think I heard that.
Yeah.
I think
A little.
what?
But that was the first thing that Hosea was told.
Yep. So, yeah, as we look at Hosea, very little is said about Hosea before he's called. We just don't know much, and we don't need to know much. He is assumed to be a young man simply because of the length of his ministry, and looks like that update did not get in there. But how long did Hosea prophesy? Probably about half that, probably 25 to 30 years. And due to the length of his career as a prophet, a minister for God, and the fact that he was told to marry, we assume he was unmarried at the time, which would make the most sense. We assume that he was young. The dialects that he uses are very interesting. The language that he uses throughout the book is there are a number of words and vocabulary that are not found really anywhere else, which makes this letter very difficult for translators. So we may come see some of that. But he had a little bit of a unique style and a unique way of writing or way of speaking. But that dialect does indicate he was a native of Israel. And the specific location of his preaching is unknown. We know he preached to Israel, but we don't know specifically where within Israel that was found. And his life prior to ministry, as mentioned, we just don't know much. We don't know what he did. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. God called him to do a work. He responded. He stepped up and did it. He did not flee, as we were talking about. He didn't, as far as we know, didn't question it. So it doesn't really matter what his background was. What's more important is the message.
Yep. Because you gotta kind of admire Hosea because he was told that by God, and all joking aside, we might think, wait a second, what's Plan B? But Hosea just did what God said. I mean, he just did it, and we see that he stuck with it this entire time, and even as we've been talking about much later, he redeems Gomer. So it's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
amount of faith.
Over the course of his ministry, again, that 25 to 30 years, somewhere in that range. Best guess that we have right now is around 750 to 722 when Israel was really destroyed.
I just kind of thought maybe he was in the land of Ephraim, just because he mentions Ephraim.
Could be.
Often.
Right. Yeah, he uses.
Obviously, he's in Israel. He's
Right.
not in Judah. He's in the northern. I think he's in the northern area rather than the southern.
And that would make sense. He does use Ephraim as a placeholder for Israel, as another
Yeah.
way to describe Israel as a whole. But
We don't really know.
And again, it doesn't really matter. He prophesied during the last few years of Jeroboam II. And what do we remember about that? We've said it a few times. Was that a good, from a economic standpoint, was that a good time or a bad time? Good. From a civil standpoint, was it stable or unstable? Stable. Apart from worshiping God, it was a pretty good time in Israel. They were prosperous. That moved into anarchy after the passing of Jeroboam II. Just chaos in the land, which Hosea prophesied through that. And then during the final years of the last king, Hoshea, when that region was captured and Israel was really exiled at that point. So he went from the best of times as a nation, along with the worst of times spiritually, into really the worst we can imagine.
And from an economic and political kind of perspective, that fall didn't take a long time. There wasn't that many years between when they looked at they were kind of at the peak in a golden era, at least in terms of prosperity and stable government and that kind of thing, to to being destroyed and taken off into captivity.
Real quickly, do you think as we go through this transition from prosperity to exile, how do you think Hosea's message was received by the people? Do you think they listened?
No,
No.
it wasn't received well. It's hard to understand, actually. I mean, you get this message that says, using the kids, I'm going to destroy Israel. And I'm not even, and God even says it. God says, I'm not going to forgive them. I mean, what are we taught? We are taught to forgive it. God said, I'm not going to forgive them. I'm going to destroy Israel.
Right.
I'm going to save Judah, but I'm not going to tell you how. And then you read, but Israel is going to, be like the number of sands on the seashore. And you almost have to go in. So the scribes and the translators translating this would have to have said, what in the world is he saying? He's going to destroy Israel, but the Israelites are going to be like the sands on the sea. And he's talking about, I assume, us. And so you get this, I think you literally got to go back to the name, struggling or wrestling with God. And we all do that. He named us all. We're all Israel sitting around here right now because we wrestle with it and we struggle with God, every day. But it's a compellingly deep thought, I think, that Hosea starts off with, and it would have been certainly hard for people to understand then. I mean, it's a deep thought.
I mean, from that mindset, especially that time, and Job's that good example. When you're blessed, God's happy with you. When bad things happen, God's unhappy with you. And that's how people thought. And so one of the points that he makes through this is, I've tried the carrot and I've tried the stick. Neither one of them worked. I've tried punishing you, you still disobeyed. I've tried blessing you, you still disobeyed. It was just a complete lack of knowledge and understanding that relationship God had.
And no matter what God did, they didn't respond. And we saw these passages in Amos, we're seeing them here in Hosea, where God says, and yet you didn't return to me. I did all this, and yet you didn't return to me. And all this, there's so many different versions. I mean, God did everything. The carrot, the stick, like you're saying, and yet you didn't return to me.
And we see that throughout Hosea. We see this pattern of the sermons and the messages that he preached. There's the accusation, almost like a courtroom. There's a judgment. There's always hope offered as well. That as has been mentioned a couple of times, this in the end. God will continue his people. And he uses so many reminders about Israel's past. He points back to really the entire history of God's people to remind them of what God has done for them and the sins that the people have continually committed. As we go through, we'll see him refer back to Jacob, to the Exodus, to the Ten Commandments, to Achan and the sins there, that over and over he's pointing back to what God has done and what the people have done to show really that this covenant relationship has been broken for a long time by the people. That a lot of what Hosea preaches and talks about is that covenant relationship, that God would enforce the terms of that covenant. Remember, what did God tell the people early on? What was the message through Moses? Yeah, I will be your God, you will be my people, but if you disobey, there's going to be punishment. And Hosea is reminding the people of that. And he's also reminding them of this idea of covenant worship. And came across this quote that Hosea's message addresses the issues where people have allowed their culture to twist their theology into a deceptive illusion of the truth. And that kind of stuck with me. That I love how he describes that, because I think we see that even still today, don't we? That we've twisted worship to be more about our culture, more about ourselves, than it is about God. And that is such a dangerous thing for us to do. It's such an easy trap to fall into. But we see the results of that with Hosea. Moving on, just the general message is that Israel's been unfaithful. They are in a covenant relationship, as God describes it, as husband and wife. And Israel has been unfaithful. there's going to be consequences for that. But God loves his people, and God will redeem his people.
Yeah, so one of the things I'd like to suggest to you is a place to kind of get started to dig into Hosea, because there's a lot there, a lot of chapters. I think there's like 14 chapters if I recall. Look at Hosea chapter 4, because I think Hosea chapter 4 is a great place to start digging into the whole message that Hosea says, because in Hosea chapter 4 there's several key verses. I just want to highlight a few of those verses if I could, so that if you could go off and study Hosea and look at chapter 4, you're going to see him. In verse 1 he says, there is no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land. And another verse that everybody's probably familiar with, even if you didn't know it was from Hosea, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. But there's more to that. The next part of that verse says, because you have rejected knowledge, not just because there's a lack of knowledge, but because you have rejected knowledge. And then it says, I will reject you from being a priest to me. A few other passages in chapter 4 that I think are worth looking at. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. So things got better. We talked about them being prosperous with a stable government during a good period of this time. The more they increase, the more they sinned against me. They're greedy for their iniquity. They have forsaken the Lord to cherish whoredom. Not just follow it, but to cherish whoredom. And one of my new favorites is, my people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles.
That's a message we see several times throughout Hosea is, why are you worshiping something you made with your hands? This idol that you formed, or this staff or wood that you carved. Yep. Why are you asking a piece of wood that you created with your hands?
So all that's in chapter 4. So a great place to start digging into Hosea chapter 4.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, just a couple of things. We look at the kind of major sections. As 1 through 3, we have this idea of the prodigal wife. That really is that story of Hosea and Gomer that we're more familiar with. 4 through 14 really breaks out the people following that same pattern of behavior, the prodigal people. And within that, 4 through 10, there's a lot of prophecy of judgment coming on the people. Wrong button. All right, and then 11 through 14, we have more of this idea of restoration that has been brought up, and we'll dig a little bit more into that as we go. How would you describe Hosea's preaching, as we have a couple minutes left? If you've looked at it or studied any of it so far, how would you describe his preaching?
I think Hosea is pretty easy to understand.
Direct.
It's very direct.
Pretty direct.
Very direct.
It's not like a parable that Jesus uses where you're like, I don't know what he's what's he exactly is he saying?
Yeah, there's no question here.
No,
Yeah, there's no
what
question.
he's saying.
We all know what he's saying. It's been described as a lot of imagery and illustrations to describe what's going on, to help the people understand, again, that parable style. Again, we see that with Hosea and Gomer. It's very emotional, and I think we understand that Hosea and Gomer, that betrayal and that relationship speaks to us on an emotional level, that there's a range of emotions that come with that, just as God has a range of emotions from anger and disappointment to love and forgiveness as we go through. And as mentioned, the grammar and the vocabulary are very distinctive and somewhat unique as he writes, that it is makes it at times a little bit difficult to interpret maybe a specific word here or there, but the overall theme and idea is very clear, very direct for the message that we want. John, anything to wrap up?
Yeah, a couple of other verses for you to look at. In Hosea 10, it says, sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. And Hosea ends the book with this verse. He says, whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. I think that's a great way to end the book.
So we'll move on to actually dig in a little bit more into the text next week with Hosea. Appreciate everybody's participation this morning. We'll see y'all next week.